When I tried to sit down at the back of a table, the bouncers put the arm on me. "You don't belong here," one of them said quietly. "Let's go outside." "Why not?" I said. They took me out to the front entrance and signalled for the well to be brought up. "Where's your friend?" they asked while we waited. "What friend?" "The big "Look," I said, "I'm a doctor of journalism. You never catch me hanging around this place with a goddamn They laughed. "Then what about this?" they said. And they confronted me with a big photograph of me and my attorney sitting at a table in the floating bar. I shrugged. "That's not me," I said. "That's a guy named Thompson. He works for Rolling Stone, a really vicious, crazy kind of person. And that guy sitting next to him is a hitman for the mafia in Hollywood." "Shit, have you studied this photograph? What kind of a maniac would roam around Vegas wearing one black glove?" The maniac Thompson references here in an excerpt from his 1971 Gonzo classic Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is Chicano lawyer, activist and author Oscar Zeta Acosta, aka the Brown Buffalo. Referred to in the book as Dr. Gonzo and the 300-pound Samoan, Acosta was the sidekick to Thompson's alter ego Raoul Duke, as the two aimed the Great Red Shark down the Nevada desert towards Las Vegas whilst on an assignment for Sports Illustrated. The assignment was to produce a 250 to 500 word photo caption on the Mint 400 off-road motorcycle race, but the whole mission soon progressed into something much grander, finding the American dream. Yet the dream wasn't found, and the assignment remained unwritten. Instead, what materialised at the end of this wild goose chase was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a savage journey to the heart of the American dream, which in 1971 was published in 2 parts in Rolling Stone magazine before being released in book form a year later, and the book would come to shoot Thompson's name into literary superstardom. But what happened to the 300-pound Samoan who sat in the passenger seat along the way? What became of Dr. Gonzo himself? And fuck it, why was he even there in the first place? While most people tend to use Fear and Loathing as a gateway into the other books, articles, and overall lifestyle that makes up Thompson's literary legacy, they tend to forget about, or straight up ignore, the colourful history of Oscar Zeta Acosta, as well as his sudden, and still unexplained, disappearance in 1974. Which is understandable given Thompson's huge presence. It's easy to get lost in the legends that come with the territory of reading a Thompson book, yet it just so happens that this presence eclipsed one of the same size in Acosta. It just isn't a story so commonly told.
Don't judge a taco by its price.
You think you might get a good deal?
Oscar Zeta Acosta was born April 8, 1935, in El Paso, Texas, to Manuel and Juanita Acosta. During his early years, he and the family moved to California before his father was drafted during World War II, leaving Acosta to bear the responsibilities of the family. In his adolescence, Acosta joined the United Air Force, but after 4 years he was discharged and instead went to study creative writing at San Francisco State University, becoming the first in his family to get a college education. Following his graduation, Acosta started taking night classes at the San Francisco Law School, passing the bar exam in 1966, and in 1967 he began working as an anti-poverty attorney in East Oakland Legal Aid Society. It would be in the summer of the same year when he would meet Thompson for the first time, who was fresh off the release of his first book, Hell's Angels. A year later, Acosta quit his job and moved out to East Los Angeles to join the Chicano movement and began working as an activist attorney, famously representing the East Side 13, a group of 13 men who organised a mass walkout of high schools in East LA. Acosta successfully defended the 13 men, and after a successive streak of defending other Chicanos in East LA during this period, his influence as a Chicano activist began to grow within his own community, as well as in the eyes of the Los Angeles Police Department. And so, with this growing popularity, Acosta decided to run for sheriff in 1970. During his campaign for sheriff, Acosta was arrested for contempt of court, and he vowed to get rid of the sheriff's department as it was currently organised should he win. But unfortunately, he lost to the long-serving Peter J. Pitchess, who had garnered 1.3 million votes to Acosta's 100,000. Yet unperturbed by this loss, Acosta continued to be a prominent member of the Chicano movement, and it was during this time when he approached Thompson to write an article about Ruben Salazar, a Mexican-American journalist who had died whilst reporting on the National Chicano Moratorium March on August 29, 1970. The two thus stayed in the barrios of East LA researching the suspicious nature of Salazar's death, who had been officially claimed to have been accidentally killed by a tear gas projectile fired by a policeman into the silver dollar bar Salazar was sat inside at the time. The article was published in Rolling Stone magazine on April 29, 1971, under the title Strange Rumblings in Aztlan. The article itself is an underrated work of Thompson's, one because of the quality of the investigative journalism in itself, but also because of the dangers of researching into the matter, as the reality that Salazar's death likely was foul play by the LA Police Department and not an accidental killing became more and more prevalent the longer they dug into the case. And the longer they did spend in East LA digging, the more paranoid the two of them became, which led to Thompson suggesting the two take a break midway to travel to Las Vegas so we could cover the Mint 400 for Sports Illustrated.
Let me explain it to you. Let me run it down just briefly if I can. We're looking for the American Dream. We were told that it was somewhere in this area, but...
The American Dream?
Yeah, the American Dream.
And go to paradise.
As mentioned prior, and is common knowledge at this point anyway, the article didn't materialise, but Fear and Loathing did. However, Acosta wasn't aware of Thompson's having even wrote the book until 1 week before it was to be published, which led to some legal complications as the deadline loomed. Libel lawyers associated with Thompson's publishers during the time had approached Thompson with concerns over a potential libelous lawsuit being filed against them by Acosta, due to the obvious comparisons between him and the erratic Dr. Gonzo, as well as the unflattering depiction of Dr. Gonzo consuming and selling illegal narcotics. Thompson thought nothing of this and assumed if he could get a signed release from Acosta, all would be fine. All they would have to do is send him a copy and get the signature. However, Acosta, soon after reading it, told Thompson and the publishers that he would not sign a release. When asked why, the lawyers had expected Acosta to be outraged over the crude caricature his character had been turned into, but instead he replied, outraged over being repeatedly referred to in the book as the 300-pound Samoan. Thompson would later state he had referred to Acosta as the 300-pound Samoan to help further obscure his identity, considering he had the police on his tail looking for any reason to arrest him. Yet, Acosta didn't care. He wasn't fazed by the drug taking or the general debauchery associated with Dr. Gonzo. To him, that was all more or less true. Instead, he was offended at having his ethnicity misrepresented. However, luckily for Thompson and the publishers, Acosta eventually was willing to let it go, as he understood changing that detail during this part of the publishing process was near impossible. And so, he willingly allowed Dr. Gonzo to go to print exactly as he had been written, but with one condition: that a photo would be stuck on the back of the dust cover showing and identifying Oscar Zeta Acosta as the inspiration behind Dr. Gonzo. The libel lawyers were perplexed at how a fellow lawyer would want his name associated with such a character as Dr. Gonzo, and even almost flatly refused the condition, but Thompson talked them round, and the first edition was published in 1972 with the infamous photo of Thompson and Acosta sat in the Baccarat lounge of Caesar's Palace. The caption reads, "The author, shown here in the Baccarat lounge of Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas, with Oscar Zeta Acosta, who insists on being identified as Dr. Gonzo."
Weird out of there.
Well, that's why they sent me along. See, he's the writer, I'm the bodyguard. Because I figured it would be...
These guys are nuts.
Even though the terms were met, and the book had now been published, Acosta still had a legal stranglehold over Thompson's publishers. And so, Acosta, being a literary and opportunistic man himself, used this stranglehold advantage, an even greater profile boost as the hedonistic wingman to Raoul Duke, to help wrangle a book deal out of Thompson's publishers, and began writing almost immediately upon their completing the deal. He thus released Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo in 1972, a semi-fictionalized account of his own life and the external inspirations for the drive behind his natural inclination towards social justice within the Chicano community. His next release was The Revolt of the Cockroach People the following year, which was similarly styled around Acosta's own life as a Chicano lawyer and activist, with the inclusion of previously mentioned defining moments such as the Chicano Moratorium March and the death of Ruben Salazar, as well as being an all-round critique of the American justice system of the late 60s and early 70s. Thus, for Acosta, on the surface, things were going relatively well for the now 39-year-old. Acosta had established himself as a reputable member of the Chicano community and had garnered respect among those involved within the movement. In addition, he had 2 books published further promoting the underappreciated counterculture, and as well as this, he was also now recognised, although in an unflattering manner, on the dust cover of one of the most iconic American novels in recent times. And then one day in 1974, Oscar Zeta Acosta disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from ever again. The details surrounding Acosta's disappearance are scarce. He was last seen in Mazatlan, where he was hiding out for a while. The last thing he was seen doing was boarding a ship, and according to his son, he was the last person Acosta spoke to when he told him via telephone that he was about to board a boat full of white snow. From here, the whereabouts or details of Acosta's disappearance have never progressed any further in the last 48 years, and he is understandably presumed dead. Biographers of Thompson have speculated that Acosta and Thompson's relationship was falling apart, as Acosta had begun asking for 50% of the revenue generated from Fear and Loathing. Around this time, he would write one of the last things he ever wrote Thompson in November 1973, which was, "I am still looking to you as my only serious white connection." And so, it is hard to tell exactly what terms the two departed on. However, it's worth noting that Thompson had hired a private investigator to help find Acosta not long after he vanished, although the private investigator found nothing more concrete than anything previously stated. But even that being said, when given the opportunity to commemorate Acosta's life, Thompson still expressed that volatile love-hate relationship in his supposed obituary for Acosta, which was published as an article on December 15, 1977, titled "The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat." The article contains 5 segments in which Thompson either tells anecdotes or paints a picture of Acosta in the, what he would term, full crazed flower of his prime, where he's held to deal with, both in the streets and the courtroom, setting fire to judges' lawns whilst reciting Bible passages and all the while having a head full of acid. He also tells of the time after Acosta's disappearance, when a man called Drake had come to Aspen to find Thompson in order to get in contact with Acosta, who he claimed owed him money after he rented out his boat to Acosta and a friend. According to Drake, himself, Acosta, and some unknown Mexican boarded his boat with a load of drugs Acosta and the Mexican were smuggling to Bimini. Acosta had on him a small suitcase and an Uzi. On the way back from Bimini, all was seemingly normal until they were just off the south tip of Key Biscayne, and what seemed like glaring lights from all directions appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The three had found themselves in an ambush, and as the bullets rained down, the Mexican was immediately shot in the head, whilst Drake hit the deck looking for cover. However, Acosta had acted fast, grabbed the throttle and the wheel and ploughed straight into and over one of the boats. And the last thing Drake remembers was feeling the boat fly up, and before fully understanding what was happening, they arrived at shore with Acosta taking the small suitcase and hopping off, to which Drake never saw him again. Thompson had heard this story filtered through 2 people removed from the source, and chalked it up to another Buffalo sighting, a common occurrence in the 3 to 4 years following his disappearance. It appears Acosta had been all over the globe since 1974. The remainder of the article includes the aforementioned Fear and Loathing dust cover story, and a small outburst of rage at Acosta with no real concrete ending. To be fair, Acosta wasn't even legally pronounced dead by the writing of the article. However, I think the best tribute to Acosta comes in the excerpt not far off the outburst in the final segment of the article. Until then, and probably for many years afterwards, the weird grapevine will not wither for lack of bulletins, warnings, and other twisted rumours of the latest brown buffalo sightings. He will be seen at least once in Calcutta, buying 9-year-old girls out of cages on the white slave market, and also in Houston, tending bar at a roadhouse on South Main that was once the Blue Fox. Or perhaps once again on the midnight run to Bimini, standing tall on his own hind legs in the cockpit of a 50-foot black cigarette boat with a silver Uzi in one hand and a magnum of smack in the other, always running 90 miles an hour with no lights and howling Old Testament gibberish at the top of his bleeding lungs. It might even come to pass that he will suddenly appear on my porch in Woody Creek on some moonless night when the peacocks are screeching with lust. Maybe so, and that is one ghost who will always be welcome in this house, even with a head full of acid and a chain of ball maggots around his neck.
We can certainly use some mescaline. If all else fails, mescaline. That's perfect touch of chloride.
Acosta's legacy has been one which has slowly departed from the persona stuck onto him since the release of Fear and Loathing in the early 70s. Whilst he has appeared in depictions of Thompson's work in the same vein as Dr. Gonzo in the book, two of the most notable being the 1980 Where the Buffalo Roam and the 1998 film adaptation of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Acosta's appreciation as a writer and activist had begun to exceed that of the 300-pound Samoan. Upon the publishing of Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo and the Revolt of the Cockroach People, Acosta's work had soon gone out of print and remained that way. It wasn't until the late 1980s when Acosta's son Manuel decided he was going to get them republished, and after setting out to do so, he found a publisher willing to publish both works on the basis that he could get Thompson to write an introduction, which he did. The books have remained in print ever since, and they have garnered a lot of praise among critics. They are now seen as essential reads in Mexican-American history. Since then, Acosta's name has slowly grown autonomous of Dr. Gonzo, and in 2017 finally fully departed upon the release of a documentary about his life called The Rise and Fall of the Brown Buffalo. The documentary features archival footage and pictures never seen before, as well as lesser known aspects of his life such as his dysfunctional marriage and a couple of stories told in this video which until then were not common knowledge. Yet despite all the behind the curtain peeks into the details of Acosta's life, the documentary ends just as confused and perplexed as the public were in 1974 when he disappeared, offering no other alternatives than were given 48 years ago. And so, an open ending is the only place to conclude with the story of Oscar Zeta Acosta, which is why I thought best to end on a famous quote written by Thompson, often associated with his own persona, yet was first credited to the Brown Buffalo. Oscar was one of God's own prototypes, a high-powered mutant of some kind who was never even considered for mass production. He was too weird to live and too rare to die, and as far as I'm concerned, that's just about all that needs to be said about him right now.